We have a real and growing Marxist problem on our hands, and it isn't really about communism, socialism, and a bunch of other related isms. And it isn't just that the stock market is soaring at the same time that working families are desperately struggling. That's part of it, but only part. There's always going to be hardcore Marxists. They're not going away. What's swelling their ranks and convincing maybe much of an entire generation to be sympathetic to those arguments is that no one else will listen to their generational plight. Every damn time you hear someone talking about the booming economy, they've just converted another lost soul into a Marxist. By saying the economy is booming when it so clearly is not, they confirm the very arguments many Marxists have been making for a very long time. The Marxists can now easily say, "I told you so." If this is their boom, it is indeed proof of late stage or end stage capitalism. Now, you may not know it, but those terms are everywhere. And they're more than just a social media subculture. They've been bred by our post-2008 condition, the silent depression. But what can we do about it? First, before anything, we need to understand it, to really understand it, where it's coming from, and don't just dismiss it. It's not simply indoctrination. The silent depression has bred new life into a stale, antiquated, utterly destructive doctrine. So what is late stage or end stage capitalism? Well, it was a term that was coined at the turn of the last century, the early 1900s, in an article written on May 1st, of course of all days, May 1st being May Day or Labor Day for most communists. In 2017, an author by the name of Annie Lowry wrote an article in The Atlantic which said, "Late capitalism in its current usage is a catch-all phrase for the indignities and absurdities of our contemporary economy, with its yawning inequality and superpowered corporations and shrinking middle class." But what is late capitalism, really? Where did the phrase come from, and why did so many people start using it all of a sudden? She goes on, "There was just a handful of mentions of late capitalism on Twitter before 2009, a few hundred in that year, and perhaps a few thousand in the next, many referring to college coursework." There's the indoctrination. Now it is everywhere, in thousands of social media posts and listicles aimed at millennials, and news stories about modern malaise. Modern malaise, stagnation. That's a phrase that we're going to keep coming back to. And this isn't just a phenomenon from the middle 2010s. You can still see late stage and end stage capitalism all over social media and, of course, academia, but in places far beyond both of those. In an article that was published not that long ago, just a couple months ago, it said this: "Capitalism, at least for a child of the 2008 economic collapse, presents a rather loaded phrase. When I reflect upon the term, images of Andy Warhol's, perhaps Norman Rockwell's visage comes to mind. Campbell's soup cans and freedom from want Thanksgiving turkeys. Even the economic system itself has been commodified. While these associations are deeply entrenched in American cultural identity, the negative implications of the system aren't exclusive to the shores west of the Atlantic. The talons of a capitalist economy have long been sunk in nations far from the white picket fences of the U.S., such that we must all live out the consequences birthed by the winter of its years. The almost satirical novelty of capitalist tropes masks a menacing truth bound to play out in a not distant future, underpinned by stagnancy, surplus population, and environmental breakdown." The common theme here is stagnation, malaise. The economy seems to have reached its final state. It can go no further. This is something that Marxists have been talking about and thinking about since Marx and Engels. That capitalism, if left to its own devices, would inevitably hang itself. It would reach the final state in which it would not be able to go any further. And anything that looks like it's proof of that state to the Marxists is a very specific signal. Because what most people don't realize about Marxism and communism and socialism is they're not meant to compete with capitalism. Instead, the socialist is supposed to take over from the capitalist. Once the capitalist has created a prosperous, wealthy society, led us to be free from want and privation and just minimal subsistence existence, the revolutionary comes in, takes everything over, and redistributes all of that equally among the population. So what the Marxists have been waiting for over a century and a half is that final proof that capitalism has indeed gone as far as it will take human society. Thank you, Mr. Capitalist, for all that you've built. Now give me all of your shit, because I'm going to give it to everyone else. If this sounds familiar, it should. Malaise, stagnation, capitalism has reached its final stage. Bring on the revolution. Part of the proof that Marxists not necessarily need but are looking to see for end-stage capitalism is inequality. Because embedded deeply within the Marxist ideology is the idea that capitalism, in order to maximize and increase profits, it must come at the expense of workers. So as the business owner continues to maximize profits, they have to pay the workers less and less and less until it gets to an extreme point where the worker is impoverished by the limited and low pay. At the same time, the capitalist owner gets more and more wealthy, more and more greedy, more and more distant from the worker's perspective. Again, this should sound exceptionally familiar, especially not just the last 15 years, but the last couple years. Inflation, the supply shock. Workers are indeed struggling, while over the last year and a half, stock market is soaring. The wealthy are doing even better than ever before. It is more proof of the end stage state for capitalism. Therefore, now's the time to strike. It's time for revolution. We saw a bit of this in 2020 itself, especially in the United States. There was a lot of Marxist fever and furor in the country at the time that went away a little bit, but it has never actually gone away. As I was just quoting from that article in 2017, the idea of end-stage capitalism and the allure of Marxism has been steadily building and growing and existing underneath. Go all the way back to the immediate aftermath of 2008 with Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street didn't actually disappear. It disappeared from the front pages and from all news media, but it has sprung forth in all sorts of other directions, with its hands and its tentacles stretching in every which way. And the further the economy gets from actually booming, the more people it leaves behind, the more stocks soar, and the perception of the wealthy getting wealthy continues to rise with the share prices, the more it feeds into this same narrative. And it's not just a narrative. To many people, this is, again, proof positive that capitalism is done. It is gone as far as it can go. What you get from mainstream media sources or from officials in the government whose incentive is to tell you all the time that everything is great. The central banks, the central bankers, what do they always tell you? We're doing a terrific job. The economy's just great. Everything is perfectly fine. And the more you can tell that's a lie, the more you look for alternative sources of not just information, but an alternative way to look at the world. And what the Marxists are saying sounds like what's happening in the actual economy. So what I wrote many years ago was, this massive income inequality becomes paramount, and on both sides. For the socialist, it is the animating feature of worker unrest and dissatisfaction. For the capitalist, it is an inherent flaw that inevitably, as Marx forecast, leads to the system's destruction. Too much wealth concentrates at the top and can only concentrate at the top. Torches and pitchforks come not long after. For Marxists, the key is stagnation, malaise, not just as a signal to begin the revolutionary process, but to take advantage of the disillusionment, the dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs, and project a more just society going forward. The economy's done. It's leaving you behind. Come over to the revolutionary side. And the more that takes place, the more we see inequality in the economy, the more the stagnation shows up in our daily lives, the more it sounds like the Marxists are onto something here. So let's put some numbers behind this. Let's look at the statistics from the United States. And as I've shown many, many times before, the silent depression is worldwide. You can see the same general patterns play out all over the world. But in the United States, as early as the fourth quarter of 2008, just after Lehman Brothers, AIG, and all of that stuff, U.S. real GDP was already 1.28 trillion behind its pre-crisis trend. So already $1 trillion plus in the hole. But after two QEs and a number of quote-unquote Wall Street bailouts, by the second quarter of 2011, falling further behind, just in measurement from GDP. And this doesn't account for all of the quarters that lost so much output that never happened. This is just the single quarter snapshot of how far behind we were becoming. By the end of the third and fourth QE, toward the end of 2014, real GDP is now 3.03 trillion behind. By 2019, at the dawn of the pandemic, we're 4.3 trillion behind. You see the pattern here. We keep falling further and further and further and further behind. And despite all of the booming inflationary economics of the last several years in the post-pandemic age, real GDP as of the first quarter of 2024 is a staggering 6.2 trillion behind the pre-2008 trend. Stagnation, malaise, inequality. Those terms would not apply, or not apply as nearly as much, if GDP was anywhere close to that pre-crisis trend. Can you imagine what it would be like with 6 trillion more in output? That's almost a third bigger of an economy that's a third greater the size of what it is actually now. A hell of a lot of the problems in the US, political, social, and otherwise, would not seem so insurmountable. And we look at the same thing with incomes. And there are enormous downstream impacts for all of this. This is not just about lost economic output or opportunity. We also have to consider what that has done to quality of life, to people's lives, the participation rate, suicides, drug abuse, all of the major social ills that have seemingly amplified in the last 15 years. That's because they have. Now, economists have flipped this around and blamed us for everything, that we're too drug addicted and lazy and won't go back to work. And that's the reason why the economy never recovered, when it might be, it actually is, the other way around. The drug epidemic itself is a product of the malaise and stagnation, not the other way around. And it continues to go further and further downstream. Consider the case of the Chinese. The Chinese are under a multi-year, maybe multi-decade process of living out late stage and end stage capitalism. After Mao Zedong passed away and Deng Xiaoping took over in the 1970s, he initiated special economic zones, which was a limited experiment with capitalism. Because again, the communists realized capitalism is how you create wealth. And the Chinese realized they were way too far behind to have any hope of transitioning into that final socialist paradise that they're always talking about. So they embarked upon a globally aligned, limited form of capitalism with the revolutionaries always on top for decades, and took advantage of the Eurodollar system's globalization wave and became a truly mostly prosperous society. But since 2008 and really 2011 and 2012, ever since Xi Jinping took over, they've realized the Great Recession was not actually a recession. It was the opening act of the Silent Depression. And living in that Silent Depression meant that China had to enact its socialist roots, go back to them. In other words, common prosperity, which is the slogan that Xi Jinping has given out in recent years, is really about what does China do in the face of what they're seeing as late stage and end stage Western capitalism. They see all the signs of inequality in their own system as well as outside, and stagnation. It is a sign to the communists in China, it's time to go back to communism. We made our economic society, we made the economy prosperous. It's now time to step in and carve everything up. There is actually good news in all of this. And the good news is, well, it's in the form of history. Let's go back to November 14, 1939. Madison Square Garden is filled to the brim, maximum, actually overflowing capacity crowd of 22,000 people, deep in the heart of capitalist free market New York City. And they were there to hear a fellow by the name of Earl Browder, who was the USA Communist Party chairman. He had just been featured on the cover of Time magazine, which declared that communism is 20th century Americanism. And the communist doctrine that he had been talking about all that time, among other things, he said, the idea of storming of capitalism is maturing in the minds of the masses, rallying them around the party's program for the overthrow of capitalism and for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat for a Soviet government. The bitter truth is rapidly being learned that Roosevelt and his New Deal represent Wall Street bankers, finance capital, just the same as Hoover before him, but carrying out even fiercer attacks against the living standards of the masses of the people. Because FDR kept preaching that the economy was fine. It was not necessarily booming, but it was recovering, in his words. He was telling people to stick with the way things were going because they were going in the right direction. And what the communists were doing at the time was saying it isn't going in the right direction. The economy isn't recovering. The rich are getting richer, and this is the signal for revolution and end-stage capitalism. Communism in the United States was never so popular as the 1930s, except maybe perhaps the 2020s if we're not careful. But therein lies the good news. It didn't spread after the 1930s, not because of Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare, but because the economy got back on track. Capitalism wasn't done. It wasn't the final stage. It was just another one of those messy, painful, temporary deviations that we get in a free market society from time to time. And now here we are in the 2020s, after experiencing the 2010s, going through the same thing. So we keep feeding the Marxist machine. Every time someone says the economy is booming, you convince someone who might be on the fence that the Marxists are onto something. Every time the stock market soars, it reminds them of how this capitalism, what they think of as capitalism, isn't actually working. It's reached its final stage. It's time to take over, revolution for everyone. It's not enough to acknowledge and claim that free market capitalism created all of this prosperous society that we have around us. The Marxists agree with it. That isn't an argument that a Marxist would have with you. They understand capitalism creates wealth. It's when it reaches its end that the Marxists are waiting for. And that's where the argument needs to come in. We need to tell people it is not the end of capitalism, and that there are other ways to fix the problem, not just to scrap it and go over to the socialist side. We need to truly understand and appreciate that it isn't just blind indoctrination. There is something else behind that, giving it credibility, and it's Jay Powell. The last 17 years have done nothing to convince them that they're wrong. Worse, it has convinced many poor and genuinely good people who are only searching for answers that the Marxists might just be onto something. Getting out of this pre-revolutionary state requires that we admit there is a problem. It's not a Marxist problem per se, or even a capitalism free market problem. It's a problem with the economy. There is no boom. It does require care and attention. But step one is admitting that we have that problem. I talked about the silent depression. What is it? Where did it come from? What is the evidence for it? Well, that's the video I've got linked below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. And until next time, take care.